Hello, welcome to another episode of the Rippling Pages podcast. Great writers making waves with the word. All in conversation with me, Liam Bishop, and today I'm talking to Jessie Greengrass. Jessie's debut novel Sight was published by John Murray and was shortlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction back in 2018. There, Jessie ruminated on motherhood, the invention of the X-ray, and Sigmund Freud's relationship with his daughter Anna. In The High House, her second novel, Jessie sets her sights on the climate crisis as her family prepare for impending floods by retreating to the titular High House. There, a home high on a bluff has an orchard, gardens, a water generator and a boat. Everything required to try and survive a flood. Jessie is also the author of a short story collection, An Account of the Decline of the Great Auk According to the One Who Saw It, which was also published by John Murray. But it's The High House we're here to discuss today, published by Swift Press. There are parallels with your first novel, Sight, in The High House, I thought, in the use of the first person, but also encompassing multiple voices and perspectives within that first person. So I wondered if you could start by talking about the development of The High House, following on from a novel like Sight. It seems a polyphonic first person, if we can call it that, is deployed to a different effect in The High House.
Yeah, I think finishing Sight, it felt like I wanted to do something different. Obviously, it's still me writing, so there's an extent to which it is a continuation. But I very much didn't want to write the same kind of sort of episodic essay kind of thing as Sight, because it just felt like it could easily become a kind of shtick. That's the way that I work, and it was the way that I worked for Sight because it felt like that was a novel that could encompass that. But in many ways, The High House is sort of much more straightforward. What I was trying to kind of explore in it, simpler, more objective idea, I think, of kind of, climate anxiety. So it really felt like I needed to find a different way of writing. But still in the first person, because I just like, that's what interests me. What interests me, I think, as a writer is the way that people describe their own lives. The kind of interiority of it, the sort of excuses that they make for themselves, the justifications, the way that they remember, all of that is what interests me. And I find that the first person is the easiest way to write about that. And there are three narrators in The High House, and it kind of slips in between them. But I guess I wanted them to feel they end up living kind of in isolation in this house. So, I also wanted them to feel like they were all part of kind of one thing, like one unit. They become a kind of trinity in a way. They are both one and many.
Yeah, I went back to your short stories, and it felt like Sight was the sort of odd one out. Really, Sight was it felt like High House was sort of a progression from your short story collection. I mean, we're here to talk about The High House, but there's a quote in Sight that I remember, and it's the promise of the simplifying power of explanation Sight, that knowing the constitution of their bodies, they might be granted understanding of their minds. And I thought Sight was a brilliant novel about being within people. There was the narrator's pregnant, isn't she? And she's talking about having children, and this idea of pregnancy and bodies within bodies. And then you're talking about the X-ray, the inventor of the X-ray, and this way of looking in the mind, inside the body, and then obviously Freud and Anna Freud. And how was it writing these characters' reflections on one another? Because they see one another as not in the same way that you could do in Sight.
I mean, it felt really important that their relationships should be the kind of central part of the novel. So, the ways that they are kind of annoyed by one another, the ways that they care for and about one another, which are not, I think, are not the same thing. You can care for someone physically without, while simultaneously being kind of desperately annoyed by them, and vice versa. You can really love someone but be incapable of performing care for them. So I sort of wanted to get at the ways that they feel differently about one another. They're not, no relationships are equal or even. So so it was kind of trying to get at those very complicated balances between the three of them, the things that unite them and the things that sort of separate them, the ways that they can kind of ease one another's lives, and the ways that even though they are sort of together, they remain kind of solitary. And I think that kind of going back to sight, that's one of the kind of central ideas that's always interested me, is the extent to which you can communicate with other people, the extent to which you can overcome your subjectivity. And it feels limited to varying degrees depending on the circumstances and the times of your life. So sometimes you'll feel like you're telling someone something and they absolutely understand everything, and you become sort of open. And sometimes you feel like no matter how hard you try, you can't kind of explain what it is that you feel. And that way that language is sort of the bridge between self and other is something that really interests me, and the way that bridge works and the way that it fails.
Like I said, it's kind of, polyphonic. It's room for other voices and other people and other characters. It's not I guess one of the main distinctions then is the fact that you are writing about, real people in sight, and the High House are, might traditionally called characters. Is the first person the key to, key to that for you? Is it? Can you see yourself writing in third person?
I wouldn't ever say that I'll never write a novel in the third person, but I think that it doesn't interest me. Like it is a different sort of project, and it's not one that at the moment I can kind of see myself being interested in. There are some kinds of writing in the third person that I think do get to the same sorts of things as I'm sort of interested in. Like Hilary Mantel does it phenomenally. She manages to get that into it, but then she's just an extraordinarily brilliant writer with an awful lot of kind of practice behind her. I can't imagine, maybe at some point I might, I could find a way, or there might be an idea that I had that seemed like it was better expressed in the third person, and then I could find a way to do it. But I don't really see the interest in that for me at the moment. I think about the way that I write very much as kind of monologue, like that the characters are people talking directly as though they were standing on stage trying, or at a tribunal, or, anywhere trying to explain themselves. And that's what interests me, I think.
One of the interesting things that I thought is that you seem to have an interest in, and this is a novel about climate change and a kind of impending climatic kind of disaster, and you seem to have an interest in scientific authority or experts, if that's what we want to call them. And I'm talking about the character of Francesca here, but I'm kind of thinking of how you've come from sight. You have a person who sort of discovered the X-ray or invented the X-ray, Freud, a very authorial figure. And I just wondered if we could talk about Francesca and the role she plays in this novel, about the things that we've just highlighted, but also about climate change.
So I think Francesca is sort of a difficult character, and she was purposefully difficult. She has a child at the beginning of the novel, despite the fact that she is kind of acutely aware of the potential for the world to unravel very quickly. World events kind of unspool slightly faster than she's expecting, and she feels, she is forced to choose between her own family and her job, really, the good that she can potentially do in the world. And she goes and she leaves her very young son behind, with his father and half sister. One of the things about Francesca is that one of the comments that I've had from a few people is that they just don't believe that she would have had a child, which I think is an interesting one. But then I also think that I had to choose at the beginning whether to make Francesca male or female, and I chose to make her female precisely because I think it makes her seem way more difficult. I think if she was a man, no one would think anything other than that she was, oh look, she's had a kid and now she's gone off to do her job and she travels a lot. In order to kind of get that idea of her of being kind of morally complicated, potentially morally compromised character, it felt really important that she should be a mother. She does seem to have kind of knowledge of she is a bit of a kind of Cassandra figure. She sort of can see what's happening, or is unable to pretend not to see what's happening in a way that other people can't. And so she sort of begins to build this ark at the High House. Yeah, I mean, like, scientific authority is interesting. I think again, sort of what interests me particularly, you know, with those people in sight was their sort of fallibility. I think again, you know, the what, like, particularly with kind of Röntgen, who discovered the X-ray. You know, it's the discrepancy between how those achievements are viewed by the world and how they feel to the person who makes them. I mean, I think, you know, we're all pretty interested, I would have thought, in what it feels like to make an enormous kind of world-changing discovery.
Yeah.
And how that would make you feel as a person, and how much you would buy into your own kind of celebrity, you know, all of those things throw me as sort of interesting. You know, it's the stuff of sort of many dark corners of the internet. I think.
Well, you say that, but I imagine it's the fantasy of a lot of, you know, particularly the way, you know, the way our kind of academic world is now, the kind of, you know, emphasis on kind of accreditation, that kind of thing, the kind of first to a discovery sort of thing. Imagine that it's not an uncommon feel. I don't think it's certainly not something reserved for science, but I guess for Francesca, it's, how do you think then that reflects on, I mean, you've spoken about her role as a woman and roles as a mother and the choices she has to make. How does that reflect then on her, or on the reader reading about Francesca? We don't get masses of, you know, we don't get lots of her, we don't get lots of dialogue from her. You know, how do you expect the reader to respond to Francesca?
I mean, I expect her to be quite unlikable, at the same time as being obviously right, you know. And again, I think that's sort of, I find that really interesting, the idea to which you can be a terribly sort of good person in some respects, you know, at the expense of other facets of your life or personality. You know, she's the perspective on her that you get in the novel is from the point of view of her children, of her family, specifically her children. They have been abandoned by her. Like, their love for her is sort of compromised and complicated. And the fact that she is doing what she's doing for, as she perceives it, I think, a greater good. And the fact that actually maybe that is the greater good doesn't take away the impact of that on the people that she's closest to. And that is, you know, that's a fact of life. I think, you know, that kind of the way that things are complicated. You do some things at the expense of other things, and there is a cost. And often that cost isn't, you know, particularly when you have children, the cost of things is not necessarily paid by you, it's paid by your children. And that, I suppose, is a theme through the whole novel, you know, that is exactly what climate change is. The decisions that we are making now will be visited, the consequences will be visited upon our children and their children, you know, and that's the world that we are trying to exist in.
Yeah, the anxiety, I mean, it's probably not too existential, really. It's probably quite direct, the anxiety we have about climate change, or some people have. You really write interestingly about the generations, and let's see if we can talk a bit more about some of the other characters, as we have the children, and then we have Sally, and we have Grandy. And Grandy, you write this really sort of interesting, intimate portrait and the interesting dynamics of people with Grandy. And I was going to ask, you know, is this idea of climate change, is it rooted to, in the sense that it's caused by all generations? Or is it more to do with the idea of nurturing and care that we have to see the characters display to help them get through this, you know, this event, this sort of catastrophe that's about to happen, this flood?
Well, I think that, yeah, it's partly about care, but it's partly about knowledge. So I think that when I was thinking about writing the novel, I was thinking, you know, what would you, if you were actually trying to, you know, if you were trying to be not a crazy survivalist, but someone who was genuinely trying to build something which would enable your children to survive for a while longer. I think it's very clear that the idea of kind of, I mean, I don't even know, when I came to kind of think about it, what does survival actually mean in the context of climate change? Because if there's only 3 of you in a house, like what is your long term? What is your long term? You're not going to be repopulating the planet, such as it is, what's left of it. So it's really just a case of kind of clinging on. And if you were someone who was trying to enable some children to do that, what would you want to give them? And I looked into it, and a lot of tins is part of the answer. And then it's things like, well, they're going to grow out of their shoes. You need to, shoes are really important. If you can't protect your feet, and you're in a kind of post-medical world, if you get a nail in your foot, you're really, really in trouble. What would you want to give them in terms of animals? You can, my brother-in-law is a dairy farmer, so I spoke to him, and he said, cows are pretty much out, because you do need to, you can have a cow for a year, but then you need to get more cows, and that means you need bulls, but you can't just have one bull, because then very quickly you get into trouble with the offspring of your cows. But chickens are fine. Because chickens, apparently they can interbreed for quite a long time before you start getting any problems. So that was fine.
Top tips on that.
Yeah, give them chickens. But then the thing that it felt like they would need most is someone to teach them how to do it, how to live. And a lot of those skills are skills that we have forgotten, which ties into another part of the book, which is about the fact that the narrative of the last century is one of enormous progress, but also enormous loss, in terms of ways of life and knowledge and landscapes and communities. And one of the things that I was sort of interested in is the way that what of those losses, or which of those losses, are kind of normal losses, and which of them are problematic, or what's the difference between climate change and any other physical alteration in the planet. If you're looking at things like the history of coastal villages, it's not like you can kind of point to a sort of halcyon era in which everyone was having a wonderful time. It was, fishing has always been a brutal and difficult and dangerous way to live, which we've lost. In large part, in many places. As I'm in the northeast, on the northeast coast, there's a bit of it still up here. Having kind of lost that history, what happens if then it turns out that the thing that we've replaced it with is untenable? Which, it potentially, I don't know, all of these questions, it just, the more I thought about it, the more complicated it felt. And so I think that Grandy becomes a character who that can solidify around. He sort of does represent the past. And his life has been a life of watching things alter, which I think he experiences as loss, but also potentially, until things really deteriorate. His granddaughter Sally, he's brought her up, and she's gone to university, and she's about to, it seems, build herself her own potentially very interesting life. And that's taken away from her by kind of climate catastrophe. So I think he became a way of sort of exploring that past, I think, and that was how I sort of thought of him. And he is, and a conduit for knowledge. So he tries to teach them as best he can how to use the tools that they have.
But there's a lot in there. There's a lot of concern. There's a lot of, I didn't pick this up so much in the novel, but talking about here, there's a lot of sort of industrial concern and, livelihoods. And this is why I wondered if, is this a novel about the end, or is this not, or is it about somebody's end? Is it about the end of a generation, the end of a life, or is it about the actual end of, of the world? And because I felt like at times I was reading a novel set within a kind of, sort of Du Maurier end of the end of an era, Gothic kind of country house sort of, the times are ending, a new era is coming in, the kind of, it's not so much a Gothic novel, is it? You do talk about ghosts and things. You do talk about sort of Edwardian kind of themes with, Lion the Witch and the Wardrobe. But, the question I asked at the end was, are we at the end, or is it something that we can't help but think we're at the end?
So I suppose that I think that is very much the question that I sort of wanted it. I think that we are programmed to be unable to conceive of an end which isn't also a beginning. And that allows us to escape from the really frightening kind of consequences of climate change and all of the other varying multiplicity of atrocities which feel like they're piling on one another.
There's a few at the moment, isn't there?
Yeah. I think that we are sort of deep down in our little human psyches sort of unable to think about it in the same way that, if you try and think of yourself being dead, you kind of, it's impossible to envisage that. You can think about your own funeral, but then that involves you sort of being present, even in a kind of disembodied sort of way. You can think about the act of dying and whether that's frightening and whether you'd be in pain. But I mean, maybe not everybody, but certainly if I try and imagine something, what actually being dead will mean, it's like trying to get the two same poles of a magnet together. It just kind of slips off. And then you find that you're either sort of thinking of practicalities or euphemisms or religion. And I think that those are all ways of sort of filling that impossible space. And I think that when we write books about the end of the world, absolutely, it's sort of impossible to kind of envisage that. And so what you always end up with is survivors. All the way through the book, it should feel like there's going to be some kind of ending which will enable a potential future. And I think that it absolutely, you're sort of, I wanted it to seem at the end like, what future is there then? Like what is it that's going to come after it? You want to fill that space. Your mind wants to fill that space. Narrative wants to fill that space. But the three characters in the house are, they can't imagine what's going to come afterwards.
It might just be one of those things. I just thought there was a lot of kind of references to unspooling and just thinking about this idea of, something coming to an end, kind of enclosed, or something sort of continuing. And
I mean, I think definitely that idea that you're sort of that everything's kind of coming apart, the way that you expect it, the way that you expect things to happen. I mean, in terms of when to end, there was definitely a lot of kind of, I thought about that in this book, and whether it was, because it's not really a post-apocalyptic novel. It's not set after an apocalypse. It is set like as that, as it occurs. Yeah. And that felt really important for exactly that reason. I think that I didn't want to envisage what was going to come afterwards. The point is that is unenvisageable. And to attempt to kind of fit that afterwards into a kind of book or into a story, into a narrative structure would diminish it. I think I really wanted to leave it at the end, at the end point of now, I suppose, the point at which the world that we have sort of stops. And rather than saying, oh, and afterwards everyone lives in trucks and, chases one another through the desert or whatever,
well,
maybe they do. That would be really fun. But, that's like people living in trucks and chasing one another through the desert. That's still a world, that's a way of life. That's a civilization. They've come and gone forever. They've always, what happens if that is not this? What happens? We're so used to the idea that, the Greeks, they were really good and then they stopped, and then something rose up in its place. And that's a natural progression. That's the natural order. People people live their lives and they have a shape, and then people die, and then more people come. And it's, there's grief and there's loss and there's sadness, but ultimately it churns on. And maybe that's what we're living through. Maybe this is a kind of reconfiguration. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's a reconfiguration, or maybe this is actually the unimaginable thing, which is the end of your own life, the end of a functioning planet. Like I don't have it's not like I believe that the world is coming to an end, but I believe that the world is a kind of scary and frightening place, and it's incredibly hard to think about or look at it straight. And that I think is the thing that interests me, the way that we kind of veer off from it. I left school for good at lunchtime on the day I turned 18. I walked home. The house was empty. I had no plans, either for the afternoon or for the time beyond it. My life, which stretched empty ahead, or didn't. It was becoming clear to everyone now that things were getting worse. The winter before, half of Gloucestershire had been flooded, and the waters, refusing to recede, had made a new fen, covering homes and fields, roads, schools, hills rising from it like islands. In York, the river had burst its banks, and the city centre was gone. Walls which had stood for nearly 2 millennia washed halfway down to Hull. People didn't say these places were gone. They didn't say that there were families living in caravans and service stations all along the M5, lined up in the car parks with volunteers running aid stations out of the garage forecourts. People said they must have known their homes were vulnerable. We were protected by our houses and our educations and our high street shopping centres. We had the habit of luck and power and couldn't understand that they were not our right. We saw that the situation was bad elsewhere, but surely things would work out, because didn't they always for us? We were paralysed, unable to plan either for a future in which all was well or one in which it wasn't. I'm not going back, I said to father when he came home from work because the school had called to tell him I had left. What will you do instead? He asked, and I shrugged one shoulder up and slid my eyes away. There had been daffodils in the park at Christmas. The coast path had been redrawn in 6 different places over the last 3 years. I have to go and pick Paulie up from nursery, I said, unless you're going to do it. And I walked down the road to where Paulie was waiting, standing at the gate in his coat and hat and mittens. Your shoes are on the wrong feet, I said. No, they aren't. Oh, well, if you say so. What did you have for lunch? I can't remember. Strawberry sponge for pudding? Tasty. I love you, Paulie. I love you too. Can I watch a film when we get home? No. Pasta pesto for tea. He took my hand, and worry burned off like mist.
What would you say to what would you say to the kind of reader that looks out the window and goes, well, it's a nice day. Well, it's not a nice day or whatever. But my feet are dry, and this isn't happening right now. What do you kind of say to those readers that will sort of treat this as science fiction, or those readers that you kind of, those people who do treat things as science fiction but have a better access to these things than, more kind of what we might call literary novels? Or
I mean, I think that's, it's you can't sort of take, once you've written a book and kind of it's published, you can't really complain about how people respond to it. And it's fine. In many ways it takes the tropes of science fiction, and that's, I like science fiction, and I read a lot of genre fiction, and I really love it. I think that's a perfectly kind of fine and valid way of looking at it. I have more problems with people who kind of look at the world and go, oh yeah, it's fine out there. Because I don't see it that way. But then, also I feel very strongly in a kind of broader way that the problems of this era are not to be laid at the feet of individuals. We can all recycle, but that's not going to save us. Systemic change might have a chance, but who knows? It was very important to me that all of the main characters, or certainly all of the narrating characters in this novel, should be young, because I wanted them to not be culpable for the thing that they're living through. They lived through it, but they were too young to be responsible for it. And both Sally and Caro have, they grew up through the kind of last days, I suppose, of normality, whereas Paulie is young enough that he has no memory of it at all. I didn't want to sort of labor that point, but I did want it to be kind of present as this sort of wedge that that kind of generational wedge that he doesn't have the reference points that they have, and that means that he has, he doesn't understand the concepts that they have, and he doesn't understand some of the language that they have, and he tries to keep that secret from them because he doesn't, because he loves them. Like they love, they all love one another, and they're all desperately trying to, protect one another from something that they do not have the capacity to protect one another from, which I think is familiar to lots of people in all sorts of ways. I wanted him to be, I suppose, the reason for the older two women to kind of keep going. But then when you look at what that means, what actually are they keeping going? They are in a house by themselves, surviving progressively more hardship on, tins and potatoes. And why are they trying to keep one another alive so desperately? What do they think is going to happen? What's the alternative? Like all of those things. Like it's not, I suppose I sort of was thinking about the fact that you kind of keep alive when it comes down to it, because the alternative is worse up until a certain point. And I suppose Paulie was another way of sort of exploring that.
It's this idea then, kind of this desire to continue to live, continually at odds with desire, warning signs saying,
yeah,
it ain't looking good. You know what I mean? So either way, there is room in this novel for, at least I thought, joy and discovery. And at times there was, I don't know if it's from the perspective of writing about a child, writing from the perspective of a child even, but there is a sort of joy of discovery of this world. There's a moment where, there's a really lovely moment where Paulie finds some birds and he gets very concerned about them. And it's also sort of bittersweet, I guess, as well. I wondered if you were aware that you were writing this sense of joy, and there is sort of as we sort of references to Lion the Witch in the Wardrobe, and there's this kind of this world is a kind of a fancy of a child. It's kind of Narnia-esque.
Yes, because I need, there did actually need to be a reason for them to kind of persevere, but also because I think that it's about the sort of fallibility of joy. The fact that, like, I can remember really clearly last spring, in the really worst part of the kind of beginning of COVID, walking, and the weather was incredible. It was just so beautiful, and where I am, we're by the sea, and there's the river, and we will I'd take the children out on a walk, and it would just be incredible, and I would I couldn't help but feel happy because of that. But then there was also the feeling that happiness was sort of wrong, or a betrayal, or it was happiness that I didn't want to be feeling. It's like, so I think there's joy in it, but and there's joy in it, and particularly for Paulie, he's a young child, and that is uncomplicated joy in whatever you find. Children can find joy anywhere. Like, they have an extraordinary capacity for happiness, and kind of oddly inappropriate happiness. But as you grow up, I think, particularly in the sort of world that we live in, it's questions about whether that joy is a thing that alleviates. Is it a thing that is it an escape? Is it something which allows us to ignore? It's really, I think that this is a book which is really just a book of questions. This is like, it's complicated territory, and I think that what I was trying, if there was one thing that I was trying to get at, it was that complexity, and how kind of thinking about it is sort of mind-bending and terrifying, because I don't know what to do. Nobody knows what to do with any of it. It feels impossible, and everything feels freighted, even that kind of joy, but you take it where you can, I think.
Yeah, and I remember that. I remember feeling that as well. I remember when presented with something that is quite, awful and terrible, and all your horizons are restricted, and you open your eyes up more, I guess. You have to find things that are worth, finding and looking for. I do remember that kind of sense of, I walk every day, and I try and go for a walk every day, and I do the same route most days. But then I was not doing that. My girlfriend and I would go, and we were sort of going down little paths and through, sort of bushes and over trees and going down routes that we wouldn't usually go down. And I don't know if it's that sense of you open your eyes up more to what's happening in the world. Maybe, I don't know what's on your, kind of what's on your doorstep, or it just kind of felt like, did you permit yourself to let these, are you permitting Paulie to have this joy, or does it kind of come with a sense of, there's going to be some awful lessons down the line? Or
I mean, I think that I wanted, I think that they all respond to that, and again, this was the advantage of having 3 characters, is that they all respond to that differently. Like Paulie is much younger, and he can feel that without it being complicated at all. I think Sally is fairly pragmatic, and I think that she can notice her joy, the sort of the paradox of it, but allow herself to take kind of heart from it. Whereas at the very much the other end of the spectrum, Caro is absolutely kind of tortured by the whole of everything, and really can't let that experience kind of sit. Like she can only see the anxiety in it, and the sort of sadness in it, and the loss in it, and she can't let that coexist. And I mean, those are all different ways of responding to a traumatic event, I think.
I think the beauty of this novel is that it's quite, reading it the first time, it's kind of sort of ethereal, and on the second reading, really sort of demarcate these characters. And Caro was this one who there's a pity for, in a way, and not a kind, I didn't pity her, but there's a kind of, you really sort of felt for her in a way that you don't for Sally. She felt caught up in this, and she sort of had she had to spend a lot of time with Paulie, and she had to sort of bring him up. And I mean,
definitely, I think that, so one of things like that is now I'm trying to think about what to write, what to do next, what to kind of take on. And it's a very, very strange time to think about writing a book.
Because of the world at large, or because of
COVID, like just because of COVID, I think, like, how I don't want to write a lockdown novel, but I also, unless you're writing kind of true science fiction or really historical novel, you can't not. It's going to be really obvious for the next like 5 to 10 years. Either everyone in your novel is going to be walking around wearing masks, in which case it's obviously a COVID novel, or they're not going to be doing that, in which case it's obviously not and either, that, like, how to put, like, it just, that I've been thinking about that a lot. I think that it's going to be impossible to, I don't feel like I want to directly address it, but it also this is very much going to be the elephant in the fictional room.
Well, do you not think this is, is this, do you think this is your lockdown novel in a way?
Oh, I finished it before COVID started. I finished it like 2 weeks before. And then there was this awful bit where I sort of had to ring my agent and say, I've written about the wrong apocalypse. I really thought it was going to be climate, and now it's something else altogether.
Bloody virus. Put it in the bin, I'll start again. No, well, I'm glad you didn't.
But I think,
surely not, though. Surely people are going to read themes into this. People are going to read the sense of impending doom.
Yeah.
Rations, at the point at the start of all this, we thought there was going to be supermarkets were going to be stock. There's rations. There is, metaphors of sort of flooding. It could be read as sense of overwhelming kind of. I don't. You can read it. Surely this is the beauty of writing a novel about apocalypse. It could be taken in many different ways, but
it could be any apocalypse. It's your apocalypse.
You could choose your own apocalypse adventure story. But I wondered if, obviously this is written before the pandemic, and
I mean, I definitely think that it must, like, I can't kind of imagine reading it post COVID. I suppose, having finished it beforehand, I can't sort of obliterate it from my memory and then go back to read it. So I do think that it has oddly made it into a slightly different book than the one that I wrote, which is in itself a sort of oddity. But then maybe every book is a different book to the one that you wrote to some extent, because it's, people read it and they put their own things into it, and that's how communication works. It's a two-way process.
I guess I wondered why this novel and why now, because because that's what you do. You don't make grand statements. It's not an aphoristic novel. It's not sort of really acute lines that strike you. And the one that I have here is, for decades, we had deferred payment or passed the bill along, but soon it would be due. And who else was there left to pay? And it's those that's what really gets to you, I think. And whether or not it is, climate change, Brexit, pandemic, the apocalypse, stuff like that really does, it works its way into your mind, I'd say.
I didn't want it to seem preachy, so there was, there was quite a lot that I kind of cut out that I could have, that was much angrier, because I think that one of the things that I wanted to have it in it, if you choose to look for it or if you want to find it, is this idea that, and again, this goes back to the idea of the sort of the history of the last 100 years, I think, in this, specifically in the UK, that we have bought ourselves more and more ease. This time last century, we're still pretty feudal in many ways. The life of a labourer was a very difficult one indeed, and then there was kind of enormous riches, and obviously that's still the case, but and there is still tremendous poverty in this country, and I don't want to sort of take away from that, but broadly speaking, we have managed to create for ourselves this kind of very, certainly for most people in the middle, this a much easier life than one that our grandparents could have envisaged at the beginning of their lives, and we've never been the ones that have been paying for it. That has always been people elsewhere, and they've been paying all along. And the legacy of kind of our colonial history is there all the way through that, and it's there in climate change, and it's there in the fact that we are sorry.
No, I was going to say, who do you mean? People paying for it elsewhere? Do you mean different generations?
I mean the people who are I mean sort of geographically elsewhere.
Right, okay.
So, the people who are making the things that we need, the people who are dealing with the waste from it, the people who are put into poverty by our kind of needs and desires. And I think that kind of buried deep in our extremely still colonial psyches is this idea that we can keep on going, we've always been all right, even when it's been bad, somehow something steps in and then we're okay again. And we just keep believing that that's going to keep working, and we don't look too hard at the implications of it, And I didn't want to put too much of that that kind of deep fury into the book, because it would, it would just be a very long rant. But I think that that was part of like that, and my kind of own anxiety about the world was sort of and the way that my anxiety, the things that you think about and try and do, the things like, oh well, okay, so cow milk is bad, so now we're only going to use oat milk, but then oat milk comes in Tetra Pak, and that I can't easily recycle, and also you need farmland to grow the oat, and you need water, and maybe cow milk was better, or maybe we shouldn't drink any milk at all, but we've got to drink something. Maybe we should just drink water, but okay, well, where's the water? And every time when you try and think about it, this anxiety just kind of perpetuates itself, and it's impossible to ever kind of find the still point or the calm point or the idea of resolution, I think, and those were the sort of twin starting points for it.
I wonder how sort of satisfied then are you with a novel like The High House at the end of it? What does it feel like to come out and have, knowing all this? Is it something that you can put to the side, or do you find that difficult? Or, your status as a novelist, and a successful one, and a very good one, how do you feel at the end of a project like The High House?
I mean, I think that the thing that that I'm beginning to understand is that I never write the book that I want to write, and I always come out of it thinking, God, like that, the ideas that I want to put in are always so sort of, they're either too direct, or they're very nebulous, or there's just too many of them, and you have to kind of refine it down until you've got you've got a novel. And I also think that you have to make that novel, readable to some extent. Otherwise, I mean, it's fine to write things that are unreadable, but I think you have to be very clear that that's what you're doing. And it's, that's not something that I kind of want to pursue particularly. So you kind of, I think it's like I have all these sort of thoughts and ideas that are churning around, and I find a kind of box to fit them in. And then it turns out that some of them don't fit. And you can't really, you can make the box a bit bigger. But in order to have a story that is also sort of manageable and readable, some of it has to go. And I'm not trying to write polemic. So those ideas have to be sort of toned down. And there were real bits of this that I had to kind of cut out, because I just thought, I'm not trying that, that I'm not trying to sort of rant at people. And there are people who are writing much more eloquently and directly about those kind of socioeconomic problems.
You do. I mean, you write it in a way that, you always have these quite sort of very long recursive sentences in some instances, and big kind of, long paragraphs. I wonder if that's a way of you working in and working through these different ideas, if that's a process that you'd identified. It does seem very sort of Jessie Greengrass, you pick it up and go, and it's even something, in your short stories, all the other jobs, and just so much in that sort of made me think about the High House. Just this idea of, sort of self-sufficiency, and but you do write in a way that, or you seem to have identified a way that allows you to, it seems like you are sort of working in and working through these big ideas and a way to communicate this to the world. But also it seems very sort of reflective of, kind of a monologue or inner thoughts, reflecting on the page. I don't know if that's fair or not.
Yeah, no, that is absolutely fair. I mean, I think it also comes out of the fact that I have never studied creative writing at all, not even for 5 minutes. So my, academic training, insofar as I did a degree, was, writing essays. So a lot of that, a lot of it comes out of that kind of skill set. I think the attempt to kind of find a way of encapsulating your ideas, of putting a kind of a carapace of language around them such that they become easily transmissible.
I guess, is East Anglia somewhere that it is?
It's a sort of mishmash of so I my family, or my mum's family, are from East Anglia. My grandparents lived in East Anglia. My grandfather's still alive. He's still down there in Felixstowe. And I spent all my summers there. My grandfather was a river pilot up the Thames, which is pretty fascinating. And so they sort of moved around quite a lot, but I spent all my summers as a child staying with them in East Anglia. But also now we live in Berwick-upon-Tweed, which is on the northeast, right up the other end of the English coast, so just shy of the Scottish border. And so it's a bit, I mean, it's mostly East Anglia, because that's so sort of tempting on a floodplain basis. But there's also quite a lot of the sort of Northumberland coastal landscape in it, and of the sort of historical events that are mentioned, some of them are in East Anglia. There's also there's very brief mention of a fishing disaster, which is based on something that happened in Eyemouth, which is just over the Scottish border. So there's a bit of both, but it's definitely kind of East Coast, North Sea coast.
Well, I was going to ask, I don't know if this is the case, or but at times I just felt like I was reading about flooding and water, not necessarily from a disastrous point of view, just these descriptions. It was like reading, sort of an Alice Oswald poem, just this way you write about a moving, kind of body that changes its form depending on where it is. And it's just incredibly fascinating from that respect. But also there is, I don't know if I'm just trying to put Berwick on the map a bit more, or we shouldn't be doing that at all.
Do it.
But Lindisfarne and Holy Island, which is obviously famous for the fact that you can only cross it at certain times because the water comes over the bridge, and you can't go onto the island if the tide's in.
In my very, very, very early kind of thinking about this book, the High House was on a tidal island rather than, it ends up having, so in the book it's got a tide pool, which is a kind of mill. But yeah, at the very beginning they were going to be on an island, but then it just seemed like it was sort of untenable or impractical. But yeah, I mean, I read a lot about kind of flooding, and I think that one of the things, again, kind of going back to the theme of, you know, what's normal progress and what's kind of difficulty. You know, I read a lot about flooding and the fact that flooding has all, you know, the landscape, particularly the East Coast landscape of the UK, or, you know, maybe the southern half of the UK, has always been a flooding landscape. You know, that's what it is, and trying to keep the floods out has been a feature of people's lives, really, you know, from the first settlers to the mid 18th, you know, mid 19th century, probably, you know, with successful kind of drainage. To what extent are we really just, you know, cycling back to that? Like, these landscapes have always been kind of impermanent and liable to flood. Actually, I read a book called Liable to Flood about the history of flooding in East Anglia, and also about the 1953 North Sea flood, which was I mean, absolutely devastating, and produced kind of great loss of life here, even greater in the Netherlands, and sort of nobody knows that it happened, you know, and it led to the Thames barrier was built as a direct response to the 1953 flood. The system that we have now of flood warnings, flood alerts, you know, from the Met Office, that again was developed as a response to the 1953 flood. And you know, East Anglia, people were sort of waking up to find their houses underwater with no warning. It was an absolutely appalling event. And, you know, I read a lot about that, and the forgottenness of our coastal history, I think, really, really struck me.
Yeah, I mean, it's events that I'm definitely unaware of, and we'll put some links into the show notes that people can, you know, check this stuff out, because it's obviously, there's a lot of flooding in the High House. But it was just so interesting to read from a kind of, you know, mainly thinking, like I said, Alice Oswald, and just someone observing water and its way it moves. It just, you know, Moby Dick, just those. It does have this sort of magical, you know, mystical quality, doesn't it? And I don't. Can you see it now from where you work? Is it near your house or?
The sea. It's I can't see it from the house, but we are. I mean, I can get there on a bike in about 2.25 minutes. So we are very close.
Very specific. Jessie Greengrass, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. The High House is available now. It's published by Swift Press. And yeah, we look forward to seeing what you know, where we go next, Jessie. But for now, thank you very much for joining me on the Rippling Pages podcast.
Thank you.
My thanks again to Jessie for joining me, and of course, my thanks to you for listening as well. If you'd like to buy The High House, it's available from Swift Press and it's out now. Otherwise, it's until next time, where I'm going to be joined by Jo Scott Coe. She's here to discuss her book about the Texas Tower shooter, Charles Whitman, and her non-fiction account of finding out more about Charles Whitman. Now, if you'd like to follow the Rippling Pages podcast on social media, you can do so via @Rippling_pages. That's @Rippling_pages, and that's for both Twitter and Instagram. If you'd like to drop us a message, it'd be great to hear from you, and that's at ripplingpagespod@gmail.com. That's at ripplingpagespod@gmail.com.